Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by oldschoolshirts.com. Hey, check them out. You like defunct teams and leagues and t-shirt form? Well, you'll find them there, but a whole bunch of other stuff, too. Do you remember a radio station of the past or perhaps a mall that you used to go to? All kinds of great cultural and sports memories can be found at the great folks at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And now, here's our show.
Well, it is now official. No more regular season, no extended version of the playoffs, and for the first time since 1904, no World Series, Brendan.
It's not pretty. Yogi Berra said it ain't over till it's over. He was talking about the 73 Mets. Now Yogi could say this one's definitely over. The World Series has been played on in the midst of two world wars, in the midst of the Depression era, but now in 1994, in the midst of the greed era in Major League Baseball, no World Series. No more baseball this year. TSN's Rod Smith reports.
The season was officially canceled with a press release issued by Major League Baseball, supported by the signatures of every team but two, the Baltimore Orioles and the Cincinnati Reds. Later, as a fitting symbol of how far apart the players and owners are, Bud Selig and Donald Fehr held news conferences in two separate cities, each reminding us of the reason there will be no World Series, the salary cap.
Like a lot of things in life, you anticipate something and fear that it's coming, hope that it isn't, and when the day is here, there's an incredible amount of sadness.
There appeared to be no urgency, no desire to go to any extraordinary lengths to find an agreement. Every reason to believe, given the calmness with which this announcement was preceded, that this was something the owners had long since, weeks if not months ago, come to accept as necessary.
We just can't continue to do business as usual. I'm all fascinated by the still portrayal of the greedy owners versus the greedy players. That's not what this was about. And that's not what this is about.
Now that we know the season is over, there are many questions concerning baseball's future. The owners' willingness to suffer the loss of the playoffs rewards them with the greater leverage for next year. They may unilaterally invoke the salary cap and use replacement players while trying to break the union. The players, meanwhile, are considering various legal challenges in response. The first is next week in Washington, when a congressional hearing begins to examine baseball's longtime exemption from U.S. antitrust law. Removing that exemption means owners could not legally impose a cap unilaterally.
Fundamentally, it seems to me, what the clubs want to do is they want to say, we are the only employers, and we can make up all the rules we want to about how and when people can look for jobs in this profession. And since we're immunized under the antitrust laws, you have to take it.
I know the short-term pain is intense, but I'll say what I've said to many of you, either independently or collectively. If this can serve as the impetus to constructing a long-range solution that solves the very terrible economic problems that we have and stops the social and economic problems that would have occurred in many places if we don't come to that solution, then maybe there will be some good that will come from that.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey, what's going on? It's your pal, Tim Hanlon. Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us. We always appreciate you going out of your way to stream us, to download us, to do whatever it is to ingest each week's proceedings. Perhaps if you're new around here, maybe you heard us on the morning show with Bill and Joe on the Compound Media Network online there and streaming and YouTube and all that stuff. Welcome to you. And if you're a repeat listener, well, of course, you're always encouraged to make yourselves at home. And this week, it's back to baseball, and why not? Playoffs are basically here now. we're going to go back to a time when the playoffs actually were hugely in jeopardy. As a matter of fact, they were so much in jeopardy, they didn't happen. It's because of the 1994 and creeped into 1995 Major League Baseball strike. And it was really the first time in many, many, many years the contentions or contentiousness between players and owners, by the way, never fully solved and probably never will be, literally bled into the heart of the season, including the playoffs, and yes, the elimination or the non-playing of the World Series. And Bob Cottrell is here, former professor at Cal State Chico, a lot of writings in history and whatnot. And his new book is called The Year Without a World Series, Major League Baseball and the Road to the 1994 Players' Strike. And it's some really interesting issues that we discover, we go deep into, and I think you're going to really learn a lot from this conversation. If you're not a huge baseball fan or you're somewhat cognizant of baseball, sort of a long and in some cases torturous history, many work stoppages around the 1970s and 80s blended into the 1990s, and even a lockout, which we just experienced at the 21-22 sort of off season, strikes and lockouts and all that kind of stuff. And there has been a lot of conjecture over the many, many decades about who sort of has the upper hand in these kinds of things. I think it's a different dynamic, especially now when we've got private equity and all kinds of other entities and minor league baseball now being concentrated and under the thumb more of Major League Baseball. Things like collective bargaining, things like accusations of collusion by the owners. I think the players' opportunities, getting paid a decent wage, a living wage when they're playing in the minors. And frankly, one of the greatest issues that still is kind of sort of hanging out there, and you wonder 100 years later, is the exemption to the Sherman Antitrust Act that in 1922, the Supreme Court voted unanimously to grant the sport of baseball. They treated baseball, or they considered baseball, the exhibition of baseball games, as not interstate commerce, which antitrust rules can oversee federally, but as a state-specific or state-only kind of activity. And I think that the modern fan would kind of look at that kind of and laugh at it on its face. But frankly, a lot of people have been, shall we say, afraid to kind of revisit this issue. And those that have touched on it over the various decades have kind of bent towards precedents. Baseball, professional baseball, Major League Baseball is the only major sport in this country that enjoys this Sherman Antitrust Act exemption. And I don't know, you tell me if baseball should be unique and different in being shielded, shall we say, from more direct competition, as we've seen in all these other sports, in football and basketball and all kinds of other sort of things. And I don't know. It's a very interesting concept that we get into with Bob, as well as obviously what led up to this particular work stoppage. And as you heard in that clip there, that's from TSN. That was that offshoot of ESPN that lives and breathes up above the border in Canada. And that evening was, what was it? I think it was August the 12th, the evening of August 12th, 1994. And you heard specifically just how far apart these sides were. And they didn't come together until way into the preseason of the following year, 1995. But lots of things were going on in baseball that year. And lots of what-if scenarios. We get into that with Bob in a couple of minutes. I mean, the Montreal Expos probably being prime among them. Arguably, the Expos probably were enjoying their best season ever and were very well primed for potentially winning it all that year. And that, of course, was completely eliminated by the work stoppage. The Colorado Rockies were still playing at Mile High Stadium after having just been recently added to Major League Baseball, and they were set to shatter their own attendance record that they had set the year before. I think they were approaching 3.5 million fans I'm sorry, 4.5 million fans. Which is an insane amount of people. I mean, there were a lot of players that were onto some pretty darn good stats, and saw. For example, somebody like Matt Williams of the San Francisco Giants, he was on pace to possibly beat Roger Maris's single-season home run record at the time. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. The game was going on all cylinders, and there was a lot of excitement on a lot of different levels, and all of that went kaput because of this strike. And that is the topic du jour, or of the week, if you will, depending on how you listen and ingest this show, with our guest this week, Bob Cottrell, and the discussion and the investigation into the 1994 into 1995 players' strike in Major League Baseball. The book is available now. It came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago. It is published by McFarland, and again, it is called The Year Without a World Series, Major League Baseball and the Road to the 1994 Players' Strike. And of course, you can get that wherever good books are found. There's a Kindle version as well if you go on Amazon. But we, of course, appreciate if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 319, and you will find a convenient link, or 2 or 3, to purchase environments, most of them being Amazon, and we will get a shekel or 2. More often a solo shekel than 2, but okay, something, a little bit of a tip in the tip jar for us to refer you to said purchase, and we appreciate that to no end. All right, our appreciation extends now into your continued listenership. Thank you so much. As we get into our chat now, let's waste no more time. Here is our conversation we had with Bob Cottrell, and let's talk baseball and this nasty strike. Please, as always, enjoy.
Tell me and our audience your adjunct into this particular story, because you're a professor, teacher by trade, correct?
Yes. Longtime history professor, actually a professor of history and American studies in Northern California. I retired about 4 years ago now. But I taught at my home institution, which is California State, Chico, for 35 years. And then I had done a fair amount of teaching before that. So altogether over 40 years in the classroom. And one of my areas of interest and expertise was popular culture, created a class on that, and so it naturally had some sections covering baseball. I created a course on baseball. If I'm remembering correctly, I think I taught it at both the undergrad and the grad level, but certainly in a small seminar setting. And I've been a baseball fan from as far back as I can recall. I remember watching it, and when I was growing up in the 50s and the 60s, and playing ball, and I kept stats. I could recall virtually any number related to the game, historically or presently, for the longest period of time. I can still remember a good bit of that. Anyway, I have written some other works on baseball. I did a book on the 1920 season with a focus on 4 key figures. The idea was that it would be a collected biography, and the main emphasis was the 1919 World Series. So there's this link between that and this more recent project covering the 94 World Series. And the 1919 series, of course, is the one between the Chicago White Sox and the Cincinnati Reds. in which the White Sox were purported to have thrown the series. That was the team with Shoeless Joe Jackson and 7 other players who were later tagged as the Black Sox. And my focus was on one of the Black Sox, Buck Weaver, whom I came to view as pretty much an innocent. And the other 3 figures were Babe Ruth. 1919 was the year that he began to play in the outfield full-time instead of pitching in an Ohtani kind of fashion. And then 1920 is a year that I covered in depth because that's when the scandals, revelations came out, and that's the year that the Sox were doing quite well, vying with the Indians and the Yankees for the pennant, and Weaver was having a career year, and Babe Ruth set all kinds of records. That was when he broke his previous mark of 29 home runs set in 1919 and hit 54. It was also the year that, as the scandal began to unfold, there's a decision by major league owners to turn to Judge Landis, who was a federal judge, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And the 4th figure in the mix is Rube Foster, who had been a great blackball pitcher and who was the founder, effectively, of the Negro National League also in 1920. And what I did was I focused on those 4, and then I talked about the dearth of attention, interestingly enough, to Negro League players and the paucity of those who'd entered the Hall of Fame at that point. That's certainly changed between then and now. That book came out in 2001. So I had those 2 books, and then in the ensuing decade, I wrote a dual biography on Hank Greenberg and Jackie Robinson, focusing on race and anti-Semitism. And then another decade passed before I opted to do this project on the 1994 World Series. And, you know, my interest in it was multifold. The season was phenomenal. There were all kinds of batting marks in particular that seemed to be imperiled as it began. Paul O'Neill of the Yankees, and then later Tony Gwynn of the Padres, they were both flirting with 400. And that's the season that when it became aborted, Gwynn actually ended up just a few hits shy of 400, batting .394, the highest mark since Ted Williams in 41 with .406. Also, there were other players who were like Frank Thomas of the White Sox, who seemed to be on a path for a period to break the walks record, which was then held by Babe Ruth. And for a brief period, Joe Carter and some others were threatening Hack Wilson's RBI mark. But most of all, it was the year that it looked like Babe Ruth's 60 home run record in 1927, and then Roger Maris's 34 years later of 61, both seemed to be really endangered. And I go, after looking at a bunch of labor conflicts, which we can talk about in a bit, I talk about the 94 season in some depth. I go month to month. And in the first stages, it looked like Ken Griffey Jr. was going to be the one to set a new record, quite possibly, but then Matt Williams of the Giants and Frank Thomas and Albert Bell of the Indians, now called the Guardians, Jeff Bagwell of the Astros, and Barry, after having a very rough stretch because of a lot of physical ailments, began to come on strong, and it looked like he might end up being the one to set the new record. But all of that became stillborn because in early August, Bud Selig, who was the acting commissioner, who was the owner of the Brewers, and who is, for me, the nemesis, and there's more than one of those, called a halt to the playing of that season. A little bit more than a month later, he called a halt to it altogether, and that included the calling off of what were going to be expanded playoffs, expanded round of playoffs, culminating in the World Series. And the World Series was not played, which was the first time since the 1904 season, when John McGraw, the manager of the Giants, New York Giants at that time, and John Bush refused to play the American League winners because they saw the American League as being Bush. And this was despite the fact that it was actually the Red Sox, and it was they who had won the previous year's World Series, beating the heavily favored Pirates. So the book starts off looking at, after the prefatory information, it starts off looking at the called off World Series, the never played World Series of 1904. And then I talk about all these labor conflicts going back even further, 1870s, 1880s, and the efforts by players to create unions or federations or even new leagues.
Sure,
and all of
Players
those would
League,
take
Federal
place.
League, all that stuff, yeah.
Absolutely. And I talk about all those in brief, but I talk about them. And then I lay that series of conflicts out from the last quarter of the 19th century through the 1940s into the 1950s. And in that process, I'm talking about a series of pretty remarkable figures, really heroic in nature. And they're not all well recalled or well remembered. You know, you were saying that you often like to focus on that very matter. And you've got incredible stars like John Montgomery Ward, who was a legal student at Columbia, but he was also a star player with the old New York Giants, and he was eventually a manager, and he was a league official, but he helps to create the Players League. And so it did well, but it was tough to compete with the then existing National League and the American Association, which was another federation. So I talk about that. I talk about some early developments in with the Federal League, the early part of the 19th century, a very short-lived endeavor in the 1920s. Then Robert Murphy, who is, again, another heroic figure. He was a Harvard-educated lawyer, and he tried to create a players' union immediately after World War II. That didn't succeed, but it did lay the framework for some improvements for the players, involving a minimum salary, involving what's called Murphy money at the time, meaning money that they would receive, the players would receive during spring training. And then I talk about the beginning stages of the Major League players association. So you've got these incredible star performers themselves, like Ralph Kiner, 7-time consecutive home run champion with the Pirates, later with the Cubs, Allie Reynolds, who had gone over from the Indians to the Yankees when the Yankees were winning pennant after pennant, World Series after World Series, and he was one of their 3-4 aces. But they too became the co-leaders of kind of a pre-union, I guess would be the best way to call it. Eventually, they're replaced by another stellar pitcher whose time on the mound was waning, Bob Feller, the great Cleveland Indian star, who was also a hero in another capacity, serving in literal combat as few ball players did during World War II, but Feller did. And then the stage is set for a period of about a couple decades when that Major League Players Association is not really doing well, and the minimum salary is just barely moving from, I think it went from 6,000 to 7,000, but that was over a very extended period of time until the decision is made, and it was a controversial decision, to hire Marvin Miller. And Miller was not an attorney, but he knew labor law. He was an economist, a union economist. He worked with the UAW, and he had an interesting past, which if the owners had dug more deeply, we probably wouldn't know the name Marvin Miller, because he was certainly part of the American left. And that was, we're coming out of the Cold War and the Red Scare, where actually the U.S. was still enmeshed in the Cold War, but the Red Scare, the McCarthyite phase of it, had been so virulent. But McCarthy was clearly a man of the left, but that was not really featured as stories were spun about him. Instead, there was concern that he was going to create a union, a real union. And you know what? That's exactly what Marvin Miller did. So he becomes another one of these, in my estimation, truly heroic figures.
Well, it's also interesting that your focus of this book is on the 94 season, or the 94-95 strike, because it almost, in retrospect, the most recent lockout notwithstanding, it almost feels, once you understand sort of the full story and the background and then the lead up to it, almost kind of like the strike to end all strikes, right? Which is what they said about World War I. Right. Of course, another World War came, a decade plus later. But it's interesting and I think it's lost on a lot of modern day fans, right? Because history can be obtuse and kind of, you got to learn and you got to read and all that kind of stuff. I mean, you're talking about a period of time when Marvin Miller and the forming of a union and all that kind of stuff, right? You're talking about a chaotic period of time, starting arguably in the early 70s, that, you had a number of strikes, a couple of lockouts, right? I mean, from 72 to 1990, you had no fewer than 6, I think it was 7 different major defined work stoppages. Call it a strike, call it a lockout, right? And this strike almost felt like an explosion of stuff that had been building up during that period of time. But I don't want to derail you.
No, I think you're putting it very succinctly and very well, and I think that is one reason why I did this lengthy prelude. Laying out the historical foundation of the antipathy, the antagonism between labor and management. And it was really virulent. And labor was seeking a bit of dignity. Labor, I'm talking about the ball players, the laborers. And they didn't view themselves in that light, but Miller began to shape their thinking. And he wasn't an autocrat. He helped them to educate themselves. He helped to educate them. There's a passage in my book from Tim McCarver, who was the longtime Cardinal then Philly catcher, and then later a broadcaster, and very smart fella. And he talked about what the way that Miller helped to bring the players along. And he did that, from 66 until the early 80s, when he stepped aside for Don Fuhrer, who was an attorney and who was mentored by Miller, although perhaps not as much as he might have been. So Miller's at the helm for like a decade and a half. And what you said is exactly the case. That's a period of tremendous tumult in American history, period, in world history, but certainly regarding the baseball diamond. And interestingly enough, and I probably didn't highlight this as literally as I might have, it's there, but it's maybe more implicit at times. This is the same period when labor, which reached this pinnacle, organized labor in the United States, reached this pinnacle in the 1950s when you had 30+% of the workforce unionized. Labor began to descent from that point. And in the very period when that descent is taking place, that's precisely when the baseball union becomes the most potent one in the country, perhaps in the world. Some refer to it as such. And it certainly under Miller and then under Fuhrer and those who followed him, or Fair, probably a better way to pronounce his name, it's undefeated. So it has this scheme where it wins battle after battle, and management is constantly trying to defeat or to protect its image from having lost fight after fight, contest after contest. And Miller is implored by management at different points, give us something, and Miller was determined to give the players what he felt they deserved. They were these incredibly skilled athletes. They were performing at the highest level, the highest stage imaginable for their craft, their profession, their trade. And he felt that, this long history in which players had been exploited needed to come to an end. And exploited they were, even though there were a few who were really highly paid in comparison to other, American workers. But even the best of the best came up against it. It meaning caps that the owners had devised, ceilings which they established, ceilings which they tried to enforce on Marvin Miller and his union. And Miller and the union would have none of that. They wanted a minimum salary and a decent one, but they weren't going to accept a maximum salary. And that was a big part of the fight, the struggle leading up to 94, to the eventual cancellation of the last of the season from early August onward into the spring training portion of 1995, and threatening the 95 season and actually shortening it too.
Yeah, well, let me ask that question though. So, just from a timing and logistics perspective, why, in your estimation, why did the the ownership proposal from Ravitch and friends not come until June of '94 when the season was well underway. Was there effectively a belief of good faith on both sides, or was it just procedurally taking so long to kind of get into like paperwork and approval process?
I think, to be honest, I mean, this is my reflection about all of this. I think that the owners didn't want to give in an inch, nary a bit. They wanted to push things as far as they could. They wanted, and some of them were ready to cancel the season. Some of them talked about the need to do that for a year, for 2 years. Some had been speaking in that fashion for a considerable period of time. I mean, the Angels owner, Gene Autry, the old cowboy actor, singer, he was ready to support such a approach way back when. And that kind of mindset held on among a portion of the owners. I'm not saying that every owner was desirous of, having this war eventuate, but enough of them were that eventually it did take place. And I think they thought all along that the union at some point would have a breaking point, that it would have to cave in, it would have to give in, whether it was a matter of arbitration or free agency or salaries. I mean, it was a combination of those depending on, what point you're indicating precisely. But in one sense, I think you're right as well about the fact that 94 was the culmination of decades or, scores of years of turbulence pitting the players against the owners. And something to remember, too, is that until Marvin Miller, until the first collective bargaining agreement was signed, and it wasn't signed until 68, players basically lost all the time. And, Joe DiMaggio, when he was at the top of his game in the late 30s, having just joined the Yankees in 36, he won spring training. He sat out and he was demanding a considerable raise, and the Yankee owner said that, the team would proceed without him and baseball would continue. And Joe DiMaggio, the great Joe DiMaggio, had to fold. And there were, as I was indicating earlier, there were a few players who were exceedingly well paid, but even they were probably underpaid. 66, the year that Miller became the effective head of the union, it's also the year when Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale staged their dual boycott, if you want to call it that. And what they did was they paired up and they demanded, they were calling for a 3-year, $1 million contract for the two of them. And the Los Angeles Dodgers, who were the defending world champions at the time, were distressed, infuriated. Eventually, Drysdale got $110,000 for 1 year, and Sandy got $125,000, which put him at a par with Willie Mays at the very top of the salary structure. And that was the very same time period of that spring training when Marvin Miller was going to the training camps, speaking to the ball players, soliciting support for his appointment as their chief representative. And again, Miller is the one who lays matters out all the way for the union up until the 80s, and then my feeling is well past that point, in effect.
All right, what's this? Oldschoolshirts.com. Fantastic. You've heard me talk on and on and on about the great folks and the great wares at oldschoolshirts.com. Like the name implies, it's old school and it's shirts, and they put them together, into what they call oldschoolshirts.com. It's like the name implies, but of course we love them primarily for their sports wear. You name the league of the past, you name the team of the past, the chances are huge that they're going to have more than one shirt and different color schemes for things that you may remember from the United Football League or the Major Indoor Soccer League or various flavors of the original XFLs, plural, or the Federal League perhaps, or maybe World Team Tennis, or maybe it was the North American Soccer League, and on and on and on. But hey, it's not just sports. It's also great cultural touchstones and memories from the past. How about the officially licensed Evel Knievel connection? How about collection? Yeah, that's what he's trying to say. Various colleges. How about dead malls of the past? Ice cream parlors, maybe even radio stations that you might remember. Hey, even there's a latest edition of the now old, Aloha Stadium commemorative shirt. All that kind of stuff and more. You will find at least a handful of shirts that you will just transport you back into your past, and you will amaze and impress your friends at the same time. It's oldschoolshirts.com, and we got a promo code for you, of course. Let's save you some dough while you go there, and its promo code is Good Seats. Good Seats. That's the promo code at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases. Hey, P.F. Wilson and your friends at oldschoolshirts.com, thank you for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. It's amazing in hindsight that this level of discord would be allowed to bleed into the beginning of the season. And
it was there throughout the entirety
of
the season. I mean, it was threatening.
Yeah, not behind closed doors.
The national pastime in the very period when you were having this truly remarkable season. I mean, we think of 98, we think of steroids and, the baseball home run record being sullied or not, depending on one's perspective. Well, 94 is when, if not Ruth and Maris's records, then certainly Hack Wilson, who had hit 56 homers with the Cubs back in 1930, that record would have been obliterated. There's almost no doubt that was the case. Barry would have done it. Matt Williams would have done it. Whether they would have gone on to hit 60, who knows? Very likely that could have happened. But that was a really remarkable accomplishment. And one thing that I'm struck by, or was struck by when I was doing the research for this book, I was going back and I was reading, article after article, essay after essay, column after column. And there's such an innocence in those writings. There's such a celebratory quality. I have a chapter on Barry Bonds, and I think the title is The Greatest Player in the Game. And this is well before 2001 and 73 homers, and whether Barry did or didn't do whatever. He was universally acclaimed, by 91, certainly 92, 93, 94, as the greatest player in the game, and that continued for several years thereafter. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to talk about, what someone like Barry represented, and put that up against what some like Selig in particular did, in my estimation, to the game. And that was, they broke the hearts of fans across the nation. They hurt their own attendance levels for some time thereafter. It wasn't, it was the 98 season, which people like to forget, with McGuire and Sosa going after the home run mark, that helped to bring fans back to baseball stadiums. I mean, they were coming back, but they came back in droves, and they came back in droves because of the home run record chase that was taking place. And there's this focus that I have, a couple of other foci throughout the book, but more towards the end, on what players didn't do, what management didn't do. I'm talking about substances, and so I talk about the fact that players, for long stretches of time, in fact, throughout the whole of professional baseball, players have used substances. There far too many succumbed to alcoholism, but there were pills of all sorts. Speed was kind of ever present, and that included its usage by ball players who were considered sacrosanct, the Hank Aaron's of the world, and the Mike Schmidts and others. Schmidt has copped to that, and you have someone like Mickey Mantle in the same year, 94, coming out with, in the midst of all his medical afflictions, coming out with confessions about his terrible addiction to alcohol. There was that remarkable article in Sports Illustrated, and there's the photographic image of Mickey at, I guess, what would he have been then, early 60s, versus the blonde behemoth back in the 50s and even the early 60s. And I talk about, what drugs did to various players and teams. So I talk about Mickey, and I talk about Eddie Matthews, who was my old hero from when I was growing up. And they were the two who were considered the most likely to break the home run record, single season and career-wise both. And neither one came close. Mickey came closer with the single season efforts, hitting 50, what did he hit? 52 and 56 and 54 and 61. Eddie only hit 47 and 53. That was his high mark. But you had other players in the 70s and 80s who were, deep diving into cocaine and other drugs, and you had teams like the Pirates and the Cardinals and the Kansas City ball club, the Royals. They were all crippled, wounded grievously by players, star players, falling victim to substance abuse. And that was at least being facilitated in some way by management. And I jump ahead later, and, I talk about who gets into the hall. A lot of these people who were key actors in 94 earlier and later, managers like Cox, LaRussa, and Torrey all get in easily. Bud Selig gets in easily. Bowie Kuhn gets in. And who's left out? Marvin Miller, until he's accepted into the hall posthumously. Who's left out? The greatest player in the game, the greatest pitcher in the game. So this is a book, yes, that features 94. It features the record chasing, the remarkable seasons by the then Montreal Expos, striving for their first pennant. The Yankees, who were trying to make it back to the playoffs for the first time since the early 80s. And you have all of that just, blotted out. A second World Series that wasn't. And the very singular denouement in the book is a harking back to one of the key figures in the labor struggles, Curt Flood, the great former St. Louis center fielder, a Gold Glover, fine batter, 7-time All-Star. I think what was his 293 lifetime batting average, something to that effect. And yet the Cardinals tried to push him on to the Phillies. He refused. And you had that part of the labor war go on, and he went to Marvin Miller. Miller gave him support. The union was a little more reticent initially. That went all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court made an absurd ruling delivered by Harry Blackman. It had made absurd rulings earlier, in 1922, when the great Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. basically said that baseball was not a trust, it was not a monopoly, it was not involved in interstate commerce, and later decisions along the way that agreed with that determination. Flood lost his case, but the owners were about to be defeated, and they were, as arbitration took hold and the players won arbitration battle after battle. And despite the arbitrators being fired, as they generally would be by the owners would then proceed to engage in collusion, which also got them into legal hot water. They continued to try and break down and destroy the union. The union remained strong, and you end up with the epical developments that take place in 94, and really in the scheme of things, this may not seem like much, but for baseball fans, it was genuinely tragic, and it remains that way to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing from a baseball perspective, right? Just how many things were going on in 94 on the field that were brought to a halt. I mean, you mentioned the Expos. Some even go to the extent of saying that it was the beginning of the end of the franchise in Montreal.
Absolutely. I mean, it was an incredible franchise with unbelievable ball players. And as you get into 95, what happens? You get the Cy Young Award winner from the American League, David Cone, gets dumped. And you get the Expos broken apart. I mean, the small market teams, as they're called, they just didn't seem able to compete, or at least that was what was being put forth by ownership. And of the small market teams, one of those was, the Brewers, and that was Bud Selig's home ball club. Selig is not a figure who comes across well to me in this story at all, and I don't think it's just because of the way I've written it. I think if you go back and look at, again, some of the essayists, some of the columnists, what they're offering, and I quote liberally from a few of those sources, they are comparing him with some pretty villainous figures.
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of beside. Yeah, I mean, even some interesting other asterisks, right? I mean, Matt the Bat Williams, right, then playing for the Giants, right? He was on pace to possibly beat Roger Maris's single season record for home runs.
He had 43 home runs. He surpassed Griffey, who ended up with 40, hitting a grand slam the day before everything got called off. But Williams had 43, and that was early August.
Griffey had 40 home runs himself, right?
He had 40.
He's got a great quote, too. He probably sums up, maybe perhaps, and I think you probably used it in the book at some point. He goes, "We picked a bad season to have a good year," and there was a lot of that. There was a lot of that going on around. I even look at it from from an attendance perspective, right? People forget that the Rockies were still in Mile High Stadium at the time, and were able to kind of jam through, sort of in L.A. Dodgers style back in the 50s when they first moved out to L.A. They were on track to surpass the attendance record that they had set the season before.
Right.
I mean, we're talking like 4.6 million fans, possibly. I mean, a record that just could never, arguably never.
I mean, attendance records were going through the roof. You're exactly correct about that. Another remarkable side.
I guess the thing that's really interesting is, and I'd love to sort of maybe cul-de-sac this with sort of your opinion about 95 and how the fans came back, or the muck and the mire that everybody had to kind of walk through once this thing was settled. Because it didn't happen. It didn't rebound very quickly now, did it?
No, I think if you look at attendance figures overall, they began to come back slowly. They come back with a vengeance in 98. But unless I'm misremembering, unless I'm not recalling correctly, and I believe I am, it wasn't until that season that, attendance marks were going back to the level of, say, 94. And there's a big drop-off. I mean, I'm talking about like you go from 31,000 to 26,000. So you're talking about several thousand attendees per game, depending on which team, because as you're pointing out, there were those teams that still did well, certainly, but overall attendance plummets.
Well, we also forget that the regular season for 95 was going to start literally the day before it was settled. They were going to be replacement players.
Yes, exactly. And the ball players called them scabs. So they didn't just call them replacement players.
Well, of course. It's union. It's of course as well.
That's the pejorative for the union men, women. But yes, and in the end, 18 games were shorn from the season. It was shortened to 144 games. So someone like Albert Bell, who actually hit 50 home runs that year, who knows? Randy Johnson and Greg Maddux both had these incredible seasons. And those were, their stats were phenomenal, but they were also not what they would have been. Maddox, by the way, he's another figure who's featured prominently. He had this incredible 2-year run. He had a much longer than that, obviously, winning 4 Cy Youngs consecutively. But in 94-95, he had this conjoined ERA, earned run average, which was, it harked back to like the ERAs of, the 19 teens, the dead ball era. And I'm talking about people like pitchers like Pete Alexander, Walter Johnson, Christy Mathewson. So not the run-of-the-mill moundsman. But yeah, I mean it affected more than the 94 season. But on the other hand, you call off the pennant chases, so you don't have pennant winners. And like you were pointing to, the Expos never won a pennant, and the Expos, were soon on their way out. The Yankees, again, maybe they'd have another pennant to add to their, how many have they won? 40? And maybe they would have won the 28th World Series instead of being stuck where they are. No World Series. 2 times in the 20th century into the 21st, with the World Series starting in 1903. Over that stretch of time, that span of time, twice the World Series called off. Not during World War I, not during World War II, not in between during the Great Depression. Even pandemic didn't halt the World Series. Very shortened season, but the World Series got played. But McGraw and his owner basically wiped out the 1904 World Series, and 90 years later, Selig and company, and the players too. I mean, they were refusing to give an inch. They left that terrible blank in the record book.
Well,
talk about an asterisk.
Well, two questions is to round out this, and this is obviously the book goes into greater detail and stuff, and we could probably go for hours just on all those details. But so I think you're kind of sort of scratching at that. In your opinion, who's the greater blame in all this? Is it Selig and the owners? Is it the players? And maybe, perhaps in your thoughts, was there an immediate sort of answer to that question, and maybe as time tilted the answer maybe in another way, in another direction?
Yeah, I mean, as I
or is it a draw? Is it a draw? And they're both guilty, and they're both showing.
I mean, as I just indicated, I think the players have some blame. I mean, they certainly might have been more amenable to certain propositions, but in the end, I come down the same way I came down in '94, and I remember basically having my heart broken when all of this took place. Management, the owners, and above all else, Reinsdorf of the White Sox and Selig. I think they did a tremendous disservice to baseball and to baseball fans and to baseball history. And, baseball is the sport more than any other that is history-focused. It's stat-oriented. And again, the historical record is just really incomplete because of what happened from August 11th into early April of 1994 into early April of the ensuing year. So no, my perspective has not altered. So I did go into this with some preconceptions, and if anything, they were just reinforced.
It's also interesting, and this leads up to my sort of last question, that we're having this conversation, in September of 2023, when literally yesterday, as we're recording this, two minor league teams are asking the Supreme Court to potentially revisit and ultimately strike down the exemption, the antitrust exemption that has existed with Major League Baseball for decades, since the 20s. And you wonder if, largely it's obviously that the contraction scenario that happened a couple of years back when MLB kind of took over, if you will,
right.
minor league baseball system and all that kind of stuff. And we've had a number of conversations about sort of the wisdom or lack thereof of that. And the corporatization, if you will, and the alignment, and there are positives and negatives to it, but largely a lot of negatives, especially from an historical perspective. One wonders, though, if this issue might actually bring into relief a thorough and modern revisit of the antitrust exemption. Where do you sort of figure that out? Because it feels to me like baseball may not have much of a leg to stand on too much longer in that regard, relative to where pro sports is generally now with the big money and all of this. I wonder how much longer baseball can kind of be exclusively unique in this regard.
That's an issue that I explore throughout the book, and that comes up, believe it or not, almost at the very beginning of organized baseball. I mean, John Montgomery Ward, whom I referred to at the near onset of our discussion, he is pointing to that very fact in an age of trust and holding companies and pools, and there's grave concern on the part of labor about corporatization, as you put it. And all along, many of the efforts to unionize, to federate in some fashion the ball players, did point to the matter of legal protections afforded baseball management.
Sure, the reserve clause.
That didn't make any sense from an ethical, from a moral, from a legal vantage point. And yet they remained in place. And like I said before, that 1922 decision by Holmes was ludicrous, and yet it was unanimously determined. And Blackmun's decision over a half a century later was equally absurd. So, somehow the judges had this romanticized notion of the game that didn't jive with the hardball tactics that owners engaged in and that players resorted to when they could. And I think we're at a different point today, perhaps, because I don't know how you feel about this, but the salaries are just so astronomical. I mean, it's one thing to, under the new agreement, the new CBA, I think the players will ultimately have a minimum salary of $780,000. That's the minimum. But you've got, Verlander and DeGrom, getting these $43 million contracts for single seasons. And sometimes, in their cases, there were, multiple year contracts. But, it wasn't DeGrom, it was Scherzer, sorry. Scherzer and Verlander. $43 million. I mean, it's kind of unfathomable. Mickey Mantle made $100,000 at his peak.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's obviously there's inflation and all that kind of stuff, but look, the idea of pro sports and business is not new.
No, absolutely not.
Centuries back, right? And baseball,
absolutely
prime among it. But I would say I do feel a little like old man yelling at the clouds on this one, but I'll stick to it because I do think there's a cyclicality to this kind of stuff, and I think my belief is that we're kind of maybe nearing peak sports right now for a number of different reasons. Some of it economic, some of it cheap money, but the entrance of private equity in particular is really astonishing to me. And
would you repeat that? Sorry, that last thing.
The arrival of private equity investment.
Yes.
Into pro sports is
absolutely
eyebrow raising and alarming, and I don't think will end well when certain issues or macroeconomic challenges or whatever. Private equity does what private equity does, and I'm not sure that multi-billion-dollar valuations for teams. And now even creeping into college sports.
Oh, my God, yes, absolutely.
My understanding is that Florida State may be taking soon to take a minority investment from a private equity entity. So I just the revenues and the migration of team sports into things like real estate development and
right.
Hotels and the betting thing. There's so much that feels unsupportable.
I'm with you on all of that. I mean, I think the opening up of and the highlighting of gambling strikes me as incredibly dangerous. I mean, it's like these people don't remember the Black Sox. They don't remember Karras and Hornig with the NFL in 1963. They don't remember the basketball scandals, CCNY in the 50s, and then the scandals in the 60s. I just, this kind of blows me away. And then as far as private equity, here in California, in the Bay Area, as you well know, the A's are jumping ship, and the public is expected to pick up the bulk of the tab. I was reading about hearing about the NBA squad in Oklahoma City, and this mammoth, terribly expensive new Coliseum, whatever you want to call it, that's being built. There is going to be financed largely with public money. So you've got this socializing of private equity. I mean, it's absurd.
Lots of what ifs from that conversation, not only for the season, like the Expos and various records and that kind of stuff, but I think actually what ifs even still today going forward. What if the Supreme Court somehow gets another case at some point to revisit the antitrust exemption? It doesn't seem very credible 101 years later since the original ruling, I think it was, that the antitrust exemption only can apply to baseball, and why so, right? Where It's clearly not a state-by-state exhibition thing anymore, as it was originally described. And it's definitely interstate commerce by all facets. Matter of fact, it's even international in many respects, right? So I don't know. It doesn't stand the test of time, I think, for too much longer, in my humble opinion, and I'm not as a legal scholar by any stretch of the imagination. But that's why this book is a very helpful complement to your understanding of baseball's history, but also the labor strife that continues to permeate it. And again, Bob Cottrell's book is called The Year Without a World Series, Major League Baseball and the Road to the 1994 Players' Strike. It is published by our good friends at McFarland Press, or McFarland Publishing, excuse me. And it is available for purchase wherever, as they say, you can find good books or digital versions. Of course, we encourage you to go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode. It is numbered 319. And Bob Cottrell is the guest for said episode, which you just heard. And you will find there on the website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, in that listing, a link or two or three to purchase said book in Kindle form, paperback form, goes directly to Amazon. We get a couple of pennies, nickels, shekels of love for referring you that way. We appreciate that very much. That helps keeps our lights on. Bob also gets a book sale too, so everybody wins. While you're there, tool around. You'll see, like I said, 318 other episodes, counting, all posted there for you. You can stream them. You can share them with your friends. You can kind of just see some images and other book links and movie links and all that kind of stuff. And of course, the best way to get this show is to subscribe or follow us in your favorite podcast feeder, platform, app, whatever you use to get podcasts. Just find us. And then if you can, increasingly, a lot of other places now besides just Apple Podcasts, you can rate and review. And we appreciate if you did so. And keep it nice, will you? You know, the 4s and 5s especially, very helpful. If it's less than that, just send me an email and we'll talk about it separately, okay? We appreciate that. And of course, you can follow us on socials all over the place. Twitter/X, we're at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You'll find us on Facebook at Good Seats Still Available as well. We are on Threads at Good Seats Still Available. And you can also send us an email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Our thanks, of course, as always, to the great Jerry Payne Audio Excellence, already reveling in the Braves postseason strengths already, and they're going to be formidable this year for sure. So I'm sure Jerry is sitting in a very pretty position right now. Don't get too smug. That's all I can say. We'll see how it plays out. All right. Until next week, thank you for listening, and we will see you. Appreciate it. Bye.